Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the March 10, 2022 edition of Collect Our Cousins. I'm here with my guest, Anu Gupta, founder of Be More with Anu. And before we get started, I just want to read my little preamble about why I created Collect Our Cousins. I created Collect Our Cousins, engaging white Americans in the struggle for full democracy to help white Americans like me become more effective in our conversations with white people in our lives, to help us build an embodied anti racist white culture, in the words of Resma Menachem. I'm featuring the people who inspire and teach me the most. White Americans, the battle for a democracy will not be won in courtrooms or in the streets. It must be won in white living rooms, at our neighborhood meetings, boardrooms, school board meetings, across the dinner table. As an anti racist, collecting my cousins often falls to the end of my to do list. I'm going to get to that next month. But if you're tuning into this, I want to encourage you to write a list of your friends and family you will collect this year and then start reaching out to them. There are 21 million Americans, largely white, who believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president and that political violence may even be necessary to reinstate him. And we are frontline in this battle. And with that in mind, I'd like to welcome our guest, Anu Gupta. And he is the founder of Be More with Anu. Like me, he is a lawyer and an educator, and he is also a scientist. And we're going to get into some of the science about how can we have productive conversations about race. And please do, if you're watching us and you have questions or comments, we'd love to see who's watching us. You can comment in here. And I guess let's start actually by acknowledging who we are and how we come into this space. Would you like to start, Anu?
Absolutely, yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited about this conversation. And if you're viewing, I'd just love for you to comment and ask questions because that's why we're here. And the only way to begin these conversations is through asking questions and sharing where our heart is. And for me, my name is Anu Gupta. I'm a cis man in this society. I'm also a person of color who's an immigrant, but I am not Black or Indigenous. So I bring all those histories with me. And more than that, I'm someone who's deeply, deeply committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. As a former human rights lawyer, I think for me, the work has really been to create a bridge between my head and my heart. So really kind of coming into this space with heart first. Yeah, and thank you so much for the invitation, Karen.
Thank you, Anu. And I am Karen Fleshman. I am a white cis woman. I have some disabilities in the sense that I wear contact lenses and I have a chronic knee injury, but overall I move through the world with a great amount of ease. I am the inheritor of uh, of being a homeowner, being a college graduate, um, that is wrapped up in land theft and genocide. So, my great grandfather immigrated here and benefited from the Homestead Act, 360 acres of land for which he paid $60. And that land is where my mother grew up. It's still in my family's possession. And that land is the traditional territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa people. So part of my struggle is is how do I handle this responsibility that I have to the folks whose land that was, and how do I show up as a white woman today, um, to strive for justice and equity and change, and for understanding my role in the full democracy is not as a leader, but as a follower, as a uniter, as someone, a bridge builder. And that
Mhm.
is good. So very similar to you, I thought I could do these things through the law and realized we really needed to have more of a heart to heart conversation. So, why don't we start with that? Tell me about that moment when you realized, okay, here I am practicing human rights law, but there's another way of approaching things that might be more effective.
Yeah. It's a great. I think for me, it was quite clear. So I went into law school wanting to practice international human rights. So I came from an international development background, worked in Myanmar and Southeast Asia as well as South Korea and other places. And I think what the reason why I gravitated towards that field was because of the way I felt othered in this country, growing up as an immigrant, as someone who's Asian American, Asian Indian. Um, so I was like, oh yeah, there's a place where like I can feel like I belong. Um, but and that's what brought me to law school. And it was in law school that I pretty quickly saw just the egregious racial disparities that exist in our country. I'll give you an example. I was interning in New Orleans for a summer. I was observing sentencing hearings and just watching the judge sentence, young black, teenagers, 13 to 16-year-olds, to 3, 4, 5 years in prison for really petty offenses, things like trespass to property, breaking cell phones, and they follow like the French code down there. So these were really like trumped up, names. But at the end of the day, when you look at the letter of the law, I was like, what is going on? What
They were
is
going
going
to
on?
prison
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
as young as children. They were
Oh
going
yeah.
to
This
adult prison.
happens every single day. And this is not what we talk about in law school. We talk about constitutional law, highfalutin ideas. But for me, there was a huge divide between the practice of the law as it's taking place and impacting communities, particularly poor communities and poor Black communities or poor Indigenous communities, um, and how we talk about it. So that's where I had a gut feeling. I used to work in Myanmar, right, before there was a transition, now back to totalitarianism. And of course, I knew what totalitarianism is and how awful it feels. But the feeling I felt in my gut at that moment was worse than the feeling I had when I was being followed everywhere in Myanmar,
Mm,
doing the human rights work I was doing there. And to me, that feeling was really about how could this be? We stand for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is
mm,
why I'm going to law school. How could this be? This is happening. But more importantly, and it took me a few years to realize it, what was really happening for me from a place of compassion and empathy was as a human being, why such cruelty?
mm,
Why such cruelty?
mm,
What's going through? Because like I worked with the judges, I worked with the prosecutors, I know the security guards, and some of whom are black themselves. Majority of them
mm,
are not, but some of whom are. Why such cruelty to our fellow
mm,
brethren? And that's what really got me started in this work. And my first job out of law school was in the legal field. I was an attorney for a large think tank, but I was also really curious about investigating. Well, how can we really solve for these problems? You
mm,
know, instead of just policy change. Because for me, as someone who's a student of history, who's a scientist, I'm like, well, it's been 50 at that time. It's been 50 years since Civil Rights Act. Yet the nature of racial disparities, whether it's in education or employment or media representation or policing, it's just worsening. So we've changed the policies, we've changed the letter of the law, but there's some clearly we're not doing something, right? So for me, that's how it began. I was like, oh, so we need a new way because
mm.
policy change alone isn't going to help us. We're really in our heads about all of this stuff, but it's really about shifting our hearts and minds together.
Yes. And I was reading something you wrote. So you had the honor of being able to study under Derek Bell.
I did, yes.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit for folks who don't know who Derek Bell is, explain who he is and explain what it was like to study underneath him.
Well, first of all, it was such a privilege, and I was part of the last seminar he taught before he passed in 2011. Um, just such a very gentle soul. incredibly soft spoken, so kind. And even to this day, I was actually presenting at like I was doing a webinar like this for an organization in Connecticut, and I connected with someone who was attending, also an attorney, and she was like, "Oh yeah, Derek Bell like officiated my wedding," and I was like, "Oh, that's the kind of person he was. He was a really joyful person." And every year at the law school, since he passed, and even prior to his passing, he would invite a gospel choir for the entire law school to attend, just to bringing that joy, right? This known as the Derek
Wow.
Bell Lecture. I was at NYU School of Law. But basically, who Derek Bell is, so he is a legal thinker, he's a legal academic, also a really, really brilliant lawyer himself. He was, I think, the first African American to be part of the Civil Rights Division um, in our government, the federal government level, in the 1950s. So again, brilliant, brilliant person. So just imagine for a Black person to get into a role where, still segregation, still Jim Crow. And he was also a theorist, right? He studied history. So he basically was one of the first people to coin what has now become such a political hot button topic of critical race theory. And what critical race theory is, it's a really small academic pursuit of legal scholars, legal academics who are looking at the systems in our country, the justice system in particular, and just all of our administrative systems from housing to education from a lens of racial bias and racism, as that has been the original sin of our country: enslavement of African peoples, genocide of the indigenous people, exclusion of Asian Americans, conquest of Mexican lands or Native Hawaiians. So like part of it is like, oh, let's bring that to surface. Similar to what I was sharing with you, what I experienced in New Orleans. Yes, we have these wonderful, amazing egalitarian ideas, but how can we kind of connect that with the lived experiences and real historical experiences of communities? So that's what his my work with him, what I studied with him, critical race theory. But there was one thing I disagreed with him on.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
And that's kind of what started my work here, because it was almost like a bet I made with him, which is that, he is a person of his times, right? He was um, pretty much raised and came to being as a second class citizen in this country, right? As a Black man, as a Black brilliant man. He was also the first person to be tenured or offered to be tenured, or probably tenured at Harvard Law School. So
Yeah,
really
and
incredible, amazing.
he
Yeah.
put it all on the line because he said, "Harvard, if you don't hire a Black woman
Yeah, or a
as
woman
a
of color, yeah.
yeah, I'm leaving." And
That's
then
that was actually a gift to me, because that's why he was a refugee at NYU School of Law
yeah,
for decades, because Harvard refused to comply by his demands. Um, but the thing we disagreed upon, which is his theory, which is this idea of convergence theory, that white people will always come together um, to sustain the system of systemic racism and benefit from it. And that's what's going to keep racism as a permanent fixture in American life. So for me, as someone who's an eternal optimist, someone who's an innovator, someone who's just looking for solutions, and as an advocate, I was like, well, racism isn't permanent. This is what we're doing together in collecting our cousins. It's really about, and he wants that. Like, he wanted us to challenge him. He wanted us to prove him wrong, right? So this is the opportunity for us to really work with his scholarship, really learn from him, learn from, the 400 years of history on how convergence theory has come to be, and disprove it. So that's the work, I think, that's really exciting for us, that racism isn't permanent. It was created. The word racism didn't exist until 1904. So, but the experience of racism has, of course, existed.
yeah.
So that's what we really need to shift.
I mean, it's so as you're talking, so first of all, I use the exact same words that, I went to law school, I studied all this stuff, but I did not realize how bad racism was
Yeah.
until I heard and saw it with my own eyes, listening to my mentees describe their lives.
Yeah.
And first of all, the shock that I had as I realized that inside of me, I had so many harmful assumptions and stereotypes about them, that were totally inaccurate.
Yeah.
And then as they would describe their lives, there were so many times when I had to say, "Wait, what? Like, how is that even possible?" And they're looking at me like, "How can you not know that that is possible? We live in the same city. We ride the same subway. Like, why am I so invisible that you don't see what is happening to me?"
Yeah.
And then to realize it's 50 years after this incredible landmark legislation and racial inequality is hardening, which I think goes to Derek Bell's point, right? So when I first started engaging in anti-racism, I call it my anti-racism puppy energy phase when I was like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna end racism. It's so doable, blah blah blah." And then elders, particularly Black activists
Hmm.
were like, "What? Like, slow your roll, this is not going to end in our lifetime. And it's still important that we keep working at it."
Yeah.
So because I thought it would. I thought like this will be so easy. We'll just explain.
But we're not at the end of our lives yet, so my
Exactly.
hope is it will within our lifetime.
It would, yeah. Well, yeah. Wh- but I mean, do you tell me about that? Like what in your work gives you faith that this will change? Because when you read, for example, if you read White Rage, Dr. Carol Anderson's whole history of how every single time that
Yeah.
there is progress, then white people conspire with violence to go backwards.
Yeah.
And we definitely see that in our lifetime with the election of the first Black president, followed by the election of Donald Trump and the ongoing um, racial violence in our society. So why do you believe that things are actually going to get better?
Well, so I it's not that I believe, I know, right? Because
Mm,
I deeply, deeply believe and I know that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I
mm,
just know that. Um, so it's not even something I believe. So I don't have to justify it. But I think to your point around, well, how are we going to get there? How are we going to end racism? And how are we going to do it within our lifetime? So I think this is where learning from history is so powerful and important. And I've, seen White Rage. It's on my bookshelf. I've read parts of it. I understand what's happened after, the election of Barack Obama. But what's the bigger truth really is that we live in a hyper segregated society,
mm,
by race. So people of color, BIPOC people, and white people don't actually connect with one another on a day-to-day basis.
mm,
They may see each other in a coffee shop or on the road or, even at work, but we're not friends.
mm,
91% of white Americans have zero friends of color.
mm,
And friend is someone you invite to your birthday, to funerals, to, your bar mitzvahs, whatever else, right? Uh, and similarly, for people of color, the number ranges depending on the community, whether they're Asian or African American or Latinx, between 60 to 80% have zero white friends.
mm,
So we're hyper segregated. So in order for us to truly be a multiracial democracy, multi-ethnic, multicultural democracy, we have to get to know one another. So when I look at White Rage and when I see everything that she's written about, I'm like, oh my gosh, I see you and I hear you,
mm,
right? But part of it is that this is why we have to bring our cousins closer,
mm,
particularly white cousins, to
mhm,
begin to see so they can begin to be curious about the humanity of other human beings. So
mm,
they can begin to see that, when people of color benefit, they benefit as well,
mm,
right? Because a lot of the legislation and the policies that they're saying that a lot of folks claim to just benefit folks who are, taking advantage of the system are actually they're actually supposed to benefit poor people.
mm,
66% of Americans who are poor are white. The
mm,
media shows us that 66% people who are poor are black. So
mm,
two-thirds of the media that depicts poor people are black, but actually the reverse is true.
mm,
So this is how what you said, these assumptions, these stereotypes get learned by all of us in mass, including black people, including brown people. But actually the truth is, so much farther than what the media is projecting. So we have to, let that be because it's a profit, earning enterprise, the media. But as people who are activists, as advocates, as innovators and solution, Grace Lee Boggs loved this term, solutionaries, right? Jimmy Riggs came up with this, her husband came up with this term. So as people who are solutionaries to this, we have to look at how things are and really have these conversations. And this is what I train people in. Like, we need to build skills, not just of the head, which is awareness and comprehension of why things are the way they are, but really skills like optimism, curiosity, empathy and compassion, skillful communication, um, collective identity, empowerment. Like, these are literally skills that neuroscientists and social psychologists have been studying and have now shown us ways to actually measure and then also train ourselves in. I mean, just imagine what's happening right now with, the war in the Ukraine, with so many other challenges, with the pandemic of the last couple of years, the racial awakening we as a nation have had, cancel culture. How far would skillful communication take us if we
mhm,
weren't just canceling one another or trying to, outdo one another, but really we're like, hey, where does it hurt? Tell me
mm,
more. Tell me more. Why do you believe that?
mm,
And that's where I think the opportunity is. And I think what's challenging about, working and really bringing, for me, white communities into this fold is that um, actually, I really feel that the majority of white Americans are already in the fold,
mm,
but they are the ones that are not vocal, right? And they're not activated yet. So if you think about, yes, all that retrogression has taken place in the last couple of years with, white communities not voting in their own favor and voting against people of color. Well, that's because they're in their limbic brain, fight, flight, freeze, right? That's what, leaders have really propagated for them. But
mm,
have we tried to allay those fears for them? Have we kind of people, white and of color, really bring them in?
mm,
Um, and I think so. The polarization is, of course, happening, but it's on both sides. So as bridge builders, we have to really be like, oh no, come, come, like the grandma or the grandpa who like brought us together. It's like, okay, what's the deal? Like, and a lot of this is misinformation, right?
mm,
So I think that's the kind of organizing we really need to do now, across the table, and not start with the neo Nazis. Yes, they're going to be there, but that's not our target audience. We need
mm,
to go after folks that are early adopters, people that
mm,
are like on the edge,
mhm.
who want it, and there's so many of those people, right? That's what we
Yes.
need. And
They
then,
they went out and marched in
yeah,
all 50 states.
exactly. Like,
They organized a march in the sundown town
I
where
mean,
I grew up in, which is, like, unfathomable to me.
I mean, like those images coming out of Oregon, those images coming out of Wisconsin of like
Mhm.
white moms, like it was, I mean, I just had tears down my eyes because I'm like, oh my gosh, these moms exist.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's what gives me hope for our humanity. These people, like all of these are our brothers and sisters and our siblings. Like, they exist and they are seeking. They want to talk to us. They need resources. But the conversation around this stuff is so ridden with shame, blame, guilt
Mm.
that it oftentimes takes them out of it. So this is what we really want. I think you and I.
Yes.
And I
I I
see.
I the, I'm trying to think of his name, the guy who wrote the book about, charity, as being like,
Anand Girdharadas, yes.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, he says, welcome sinner, that we should learn from evangelical Christians. When a non-church member shows up at the evangelical church,
Yeah.
the response isn't, "You terrible sinner, where have you been?
Yeah.
You should feel guilty and shameful." No, the response is, "Welcome, sinner, for I
Exactly.
have sinned too." So I agree with you 100%, Anu, is that sometimes in our messaging, we are not as welcoming as we
Mm,
could be of new people joining who are at their very beginning stages
yeah.
and still learning and making a lot of mistakes and stumbling. Now, with that said, I think the onus is upon other white Americans who are further along in our journey to welcome those folks to the
Mm,
fold, because I don't want to cause any more harm to
yeah.
Black people, indigenous people, what Dr. Twyla Baker calls um, translation exhaustion.
I
That when
agree.
white people finally do show up, then they expect indigenous people, Black people, to educate them
Right.
about the entire history of everything that's happened up to present day before they're even ready to start. So I urge folks who are on the beginning stages of this. There are so many amazing places you can enter. For
Yeah.
example, showing up for racial justice surge. For example, uh, uh, Garrett Bucks, who was on our previous show with the Barn Raisers Project. So many people, Tama Okun, Mab Segrest, like before, like diving in there, like take some time and educate ourselves about the white anti-racist current day and in the past,
Mm,
and Braden, who've done this work,
yeah.
and that will help you to show up and come correct when you enter into multiracial
Yeah.
organizing space.
I would just qualify two things to that. I totally agree with everything you've said, but I feel like there are BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are willing to have those
Yes,
conversations, who are willing to train, who are willing to support white people through it. I being one of them, right? So for me, it's like I don't care what part of the journey you're on because for me, it actually gives me energy. It doesn't exhaust me because it actually makes me feel like I'm connected to other human beings who just have white skin or European ancestry. So I think yes, there are people because of the causes and circumstances of their lives where, particularly if they're of color, it feels like a burden. It's like I don't want to explain this to you over and over again,
mm,
and that's okay, and I want to respect that. But there are also people who want to do it. They want to be bridge builders. So yes, I encourage folks to do surge and all of the things you've said, but I also encourage them to seek out
and
BIPOC
pay.
people, yeah, and pay them or not pay them. Maybe they're friends. Because part of the challenge here is that we are in a hyper segregated society.
Mm.
So, like, if white folks were just talking to white people about racism, you still don't get the social contact that's needed for us to actually break these age-old mental fabrications that race has constructed, right?
I
So,
agree with you
yeah,
100% on that. And
and the,
my greatest learning
yeah,
has come from paying Black women educators
sure,
who were incredible, got me going. Also, Indigenous Native American, my mentor, Sweetwater Nanook, founder of Idle No More Washington,
that's great.
incredible, incredible growth. But then my ongoing growth comes from my Black women mentors
Yeah.
who really uh, what Adrienne Marie Brown describes as her woes working on excellence.
Yeah,
They hold me in loving accountability and really push me um, to just keep deepening my practice and just I agree with you 100%. And some people think that I don't know, I get some criticism for
Yeah.
saying this, but I fundamentally believe that interpersonal relationships are the foundation of social change, right?
And that's what research has shown too. Like the one thing, like I train people in all these tools to break bias, whether it's stereotype replacement or individuation or pro-social behaviors. But beyond these tools that we can practice on our own, the one thing that continues to work in kind of breaking down barriers and biases is intergroup contact,
Yes.
social relations, right? So we need that social contact. So I don't want folks to, again, feel like they have to polarize. The other thing I wanted to add, though, was really about white communities and what I have noticed. I'm not a white person, but I'll share with you this example. So I attended my first. So this is another reason why I don't call myself an anti-racist, but we can talk about that in a second. I attended my first dismantling racism workshop, probably like 12 or 13 years ago. It was at the People's Institute. Beautiful, amazing time. Like I met some of the founders, these like idols of kind of the movement for racial equality and justice. And there was one of my trainers was a white woman. She was in her 60s then, so she's probably in her 70s now, and had been basically she was part of the civil rights movement. She's from Alabama, still lives there. She I mean, not bust, she lived there, but she was fighting for equality next to Black people since day one. Amazing person. But she said to me something that really kind of hit me in my core. Because I was like, oh my God, you're an amazing human being. Like, I want you to be like my advisor, my mentor, and really help me really shape this thing forward. And she said, I can't do that because
Mm,
I'm white and racism is in my bones.
mm,
Like, I have racism in the blood that I carry. And that just like shook me to my core,
mm.
because what she expressed to me in that moment, and this is just one person, so I don't want this to generalize. I don't want to generalize it to every anti-racist white person. She's someone who's dedicated her life to end racism. She does these trainings left and right and has been doing them for 40, 50 years. But in that moment, I saw her as a human being and I was like, wow, there's a lot of self-loathing here.
Mm,
There's a lot of self-loathing here, which is what the system of white supremacy and systemic racism wants white people to have.
mm,
Because what is racism? I am better than you. I want to oppress you. Why? Because I say so.
mm.
So if you feel that sense of self-loathing that you're not good enough, you're going to continue to hurt other people.
Yeah.
And for me, so for white folks who are leading anti-racist movements, who are creating anti-racist communities, compassion, curiosity, healing is so necessary, particularly if you're working with white folks whose ancestors may or may not have enslaved people, may or may not have, murdered, lynched people, may or may not have attended gatherings where there were lynchings happening, may or may not have, taken land, removed people from their land, from their ways of being. That's all at the psychic level. There's a lot of guilt and shame there.
There is a lot of guilt and shame there,
So
and
we have to heal that.
yes, the intergenerational trauma is real, and we don't talk a lot about the
Yeah.
intergenerational trauma among white bodies. But the greatest growth that I've experienced is working with Resma Menachem and
Mhm.
the My Grandmother's Hands, and I
He's coming
did.
out with a new book.
Yes, yes, I did his in-person workshop, highly recommend, and now I'm in the 6-month long Foundations of Somatic Abolitionism. But what he talks about in there, why were white people so violent from the moment we set foot in this country, was rooted in the 1,000 years of violence we were inflicting on each other before we even got here, right? So we were carrying all this intergenerational trauma of having been attacking and
Mhm.
or attacked ourselves. A lot of it was a public spectacle of violence. drawing and quartering in front of everybody, or particular forms of torture of outspoken women, public executions, etc. And then we came to this country, and as he says, uh, elite white people said to poor white people, join us in whiteness and we won't harm you anymore. And instead, go harm those over there who are not even fully human. Uh, and in exchange for that, we will give you land, we will give you protection, you'll be able to carry a gun, you'll be able to vote, like you'll be a part, equal with
Yeah.
us, in the while clearly maintaining
Mhm.
stratification and keeping them down, but giving them that sense of superiority that they were better than, which made them satisfied with that place. And I keep saying they, but it's actually we, right? So I am carrying the intergenerational trauma from all of that, which since working with Resma, I've gotten much more curious about my ancestry. And I mean, it's a little complicated because I'm adopted, but I actually have found now my biological parents, which I had not,
Wow.
I had never wanted to do because I was so happy and satisfied with my
Yeah.
adoptive parents. But I've been studying both my parents. I call them my parents. I mean, the people who adopted me are my parents, you know. I studied that ancestry all the way back to the 1700s to see, what were my people involved in, as well as now learning about my biological ancestry,
Yeah.
which when I got my ancestry.com results back, I am like the whitest of the white. I'm from like Sweden, Iceland, Lithuania, like England, Germany, like I was yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
this conversation isn't about me. This is about you.
No, this is
But
it's about us. It's about us, and this is how we're relating. This is beautiful. Thank you for sharing
yeah,
that.
but I highly encourage white people to examine that history. And let me tell you, when I first got involved in this work, I had so much guilt and so much shame. And I mean, I cried buckets, buckets of white women tears, right? Because it is a lot to realize all
Mhm.
the harm that I have caused personally, continue to cause, what my ancestors did, what I learned, that the people who I love the most taught me a bunch of harmful beliefs. It's a lot to grapple with. So if you're feeling that way, that is completely, completely normal. And I encourage you to get a group and process those feelings together. Don't fade back. Come forward and find some folks who you can be with to work through those feelings. That is so so important. Resma also says the harm that was done to us was not done to us individually. It was done to us collectively. And so the healing has to be collective.
Collective. It needs to be. And I think in a similar note, I think people of color, that's their work as well.
Mm,
There's we in our communities, because of colonization, because of enslavement, because of genocide, and this is global, right? So this is, of course, so a lot of the Asian Americans, Latin American immigrants that come here, yes, we weren't, our ancestors weren't here in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. Some of them were, um, but this idea of white superiority was the justification for colonization of Algeria or Indonesia or India or any of those countries, right? So for me, like, we are all interconnected, and there's a lot of healing that needs to be done for us on how we've learned these toxic messaging about our own inferiority,
mm,
and to let go of them, to no longer believe them. And I think for people of color, there's a more challenging process of healing. This might be true for some white folks as well, which is that a lot of us actually have those same white ancestors.
mm.
given the atrocious history of
Mm,
enslavement and, you know, we have European blood in our veins,
mm,
whether they were the slave master or out of consent. And because of the guilt and the shame of this puritanical culture, or just anger and hatred towards how our systems are operating, we don't acknowledge that ancestry.
mm,
But that fear that Resma is talking about, from those public squares with witch hunts and the wars that took place between Germany and France every 5 years, or England and France, or Spain and Portugal, or you name it, that blood is in us too.
yes.
Because whether it was whether it was willful or not, we are still a product of that history,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
of course we have to kind of understand and heal the harms of enslavement or genocide or immigration or exclusion, but also the other side. And that feels overwhelming. That feels like a lot. And this is why, somatic abolitionism or somatic experiencing. The beautiful thing is, we live in a time where we've surpassed the information age. We know why things are. We have solutions. Scientists have studied it. They've written books about it. They've written papers about it. But now it's really the opportunity for us to apply it. So
Yes.
this is why we need to move from our head to our heart. So as you shared what you're doing, like, I want to encourage everyone to like work with Resma or other practitioners like him. Um, Tommy Lee Woon and Thea Lee, both based in Minneapolis, dear friends and teachers of mine. They are kind of the original folks who, looked at somatic experiencing and applied it to racism and how racism manifests. They're both Asian American, have their own like history of experiencing racism, but how it kind of really works in different types of human bodies, whether they're indigenous bodies or black bodies or brown bodies. So we have that opportunity to heal ourselves. But the question that I pose to all my students, what is it that you're going to choose?
Mm,
Are you going to choose to heal, or are you going to choose to stay a victim?
mm,
You know, or choose to stay in pain? Choose, because like for me, that was my journey. Because I don't think I've shared this with you, but racism took me to a point where I almost killed myself. I took my own
mm,
life, right? I jumped off of the building that I was living in. So for me, like, I have kind of seen the lowest of the lowest kind of places one can imagine, which
mm,
doesn't mean that I understand what it's like to be Black or Indigenous or any of those things. But in my lived experience, it took me to that lowest point. And then I was given a gift of, well, I'm alive, right? Every day it's like, oh my God, I'm alive. Um, so it's like, oh, I can choose to actually heal those wounds and not let them overwhelm me anymore. Because yes,
mm,
all these awful things happened. My ancestors were beaten. They were, the Indian independence movement was one of the most bloodiest
mm,
movements, um, because it's such a huge country. Like the numbers of people that the British killed and maimed, we don't even know, but it goes possibly in the hundreds of millions,
mm,
right? But part of it is that, yes, that happened, but that didn't happen to me.
mm,
So I am keeping that memory alive and imagining that. And I'm like, oh, wow, like I have that ability to be empathetic to with people that lived before me, but I'm not them. So just as I have that ability to imagine what must have happened to them as they were enslaved and stolen, and I also have that ability to heal because there were so
mm,
many of those people that were healers. Harriet Tubman, so many indigenous chiefs that we have. Thich Nhat Hanh, who just passed away. The
mm,
Dalai Lama, I'm like, oh my God, if that's not an experience of racism, I don't know what is, where he had to move his entire nation. um, Some like Desmond Tutu, who also just passed. Like, I'm like, yes. So we have to kind of, yes, there's awful things, but there are also these beacons of hope. And if we can really gravitate our energy towards that space, we can truly, be the change that we want to see, which is end racism within our lifetime.
mm. Yes. It's the image I'm seeing is like when you have a candle and it's lit and you pass the flame to another person who has the candle and they pass the flame to somebody else, you know?
Yeah.
And how can we be that gentle in the way that we touch others' lives?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Giving ourselves grace first and then giving each other grace. Because I find that, whenever I'm cruel with whenever I'm cruel with my words or my passive aggression or, all the things, right? All the things that we have, I notice that that's how I act towards myself.
Mm.
Because can you imagine someone who's living in their hearts trying to practice microaggressions or gaslighting another human being or, you know, hurting or maiming them? I mean, I can't. If someone who's truly living in their heart space, I can't imagine them doing those things.
And
So
that if they do those things,
yeah,
that they would take accountability
have
for
to
it.
take response. Like, oh my gosh, and I feel that sometimes. Sometimes I say things, and as I'm like doing more and more of the work that you're doing, around somatic abolitionism, somatic experiencing, something in my own nervous system informs me, hey, the way you said that might have been harmful.
Mm,
And then my conscience won't let me, I can't move on without addressing it.
mm,
And it happens with my family members, which has been such a gift because, my relationship with my family members has transformed because of this work. Their relationship with each other, with me, has transformed, with their patients, and my parents are doctors. Um, so I'm like, oh wow, this is a ripple effect.
wow. When you calm your nervous system,
Yeah.
it does have a ripple effect to others, and people will seek you out.
Hmm.
This on Saturday, a woman with Down syndrome who's entering that stage of Down syndrome. She's 47 years old, where she's starting to get Alzheimer's that afflicts people with Down syndrome. So she had been having a lot of seizures that day, and she came and I hugged her and she pressed her head like right on my heart. Like I could
Mm,
see in her face there was so much like tension and pain, and then when she pressed her head on my heart, like, I could just see her kind of relax in that moment, and I totally felt what you're feeling. Now, at the same time, I can be so passive aggressive, like, with my kids or with my mom, and then I feel this tremendous charge, like, "Why am I doing this?" It's often when I'm trying to perform motherhood, right? I'm trying to perform making dinner as opposed to, like
yeah. What have you discovered, like, when did you become mindful of the fact that, oh, I'm being passive aggressive. This might be harmful. Like, what's going on for you when that happens? Have you noticed what is the
it's a lot
deeper
of
desire?
shoulding. It's a lot of shoulding,
Yeah,
right?
lots
I
of
should
should.
make dinner now, and they should appreciate that I've made this dinner.
Oh yeah. So, I did a training in nonviolent communication years ago, like when I first started this work, because I was like a big sponge. And the one thing, I forget the person who created this methodology, his name, but it's like you should. But the one word to delete from your vocabulary if you want to be an educator around this work is should. So
Mm,
whenever should comes up, it's a red flag
mm,
because should is wanting things to be other than they are.
mm,
and and what we need to practice, or he was training us, is being with how things are,
mm.
being with that discomfort
Yes. Not
gently.
fixing anything, not changing anything, accepting and great
Yeah,
graciously and gracefully
yeah,
being. Yes.
and that will create the change
Yes.
because that's
Yes.
I love that imagery of candles kind of moving from one person to another. Yeah.
Beautiful. How can people contact you? How can they follow your work?
Yeah. So please find our work at, bemorewithanu.com. So BEMORE with Anu. My name is ANU.com, or follow us on any of the socials, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Facebook at Be More with Anu. One thing I did want to share is that we have just launched a membership program called Breaking Racial Bias, which is it can also be a credentialing program, but it's a pretty thorough look into understanding um, what systemic racism is, its connection to racial bias, and then actually learning the skills that are rooted in mindfulness to break racial bias. And we're able to measure that for folks while being in community with professionals across sectors who are championing this work. So do check that out. Um, Certainly something that I love to do, and hopefully, with you, Karen, we're building a movement of folks who are now going to be innovating solutions to, all forms of biases that exist in our workplaces and communities.
Thank you so much. And please do join us next March 17th, next Thursday. We will have Mindy Gulati, who's also an attorney, an amazing white woman doing great work in this space. And she lives in Austin, Texas. So we have a lot to talk about what's going on in Texas and how can we be supportive.
Mm.
And to close up, I just want to ask you if you could wave a magic wand and get white people to either start doing something or stop doing something, what would it be and why?
Hmm. That's a great question. Well, if I could wave a magic wand, it would probably be for everyone, not just white folks, but of course, white folks included, is to take a few moments every day to just place their hand on their heart
Mm,
and just listen to themselves breathing.
mm,
So for 60 seconds. And the reason why I say that is because that is the beginning of breaking bias. Because the heart that beats inside their bodies is the same heart that beats in the bodies of every other human being, regardless of the external organ, which is our skin color, or
mm.
our, facial features or our hair texture. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I love that. Anu Gupta, thank you for joining us on Collect Our Cousins. Everybody who's watching, thank you so much for joining us. This was such an amazing conversation. You nailed it.
Oh, thank you, Morolake.
Thank
That's
you,
great.
Morolake Omowumi de Kunle. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and we'll see
Thank
you next
you.
week.
Bye bye.
Bye.